In Chinese Asia, history is now. Imagine for a moment the emperor's view of the world in 1793 and the Chinese place in it. Proud of China's homegrown accomplishments in art, science, literature, and government, and aware that every surrounding culture looked to China for ideas and inspirations, it must have been a heady feeling. No other culture could compete with the Chinese in any way, in art or arms, and every culture the Chinese knew and had met over the millennia wanted to be like the Chinese, wanted to learn from the Chinese. Not so the Western actors about to enter the Chinese stage, and there tells the tale. For the first time in its long history, China met people who did not want to learn from the Chinese. They wanted to change China. How they wanted to change China and why, and how the Chinese tried to deal with these new challenges to Chinese superior position, sets the stage for the next act, the start of the end of everlasting China. 3 different types of Westerners came to change China. Missionaries wanting China to convert to Christianity, traders wanting China to allow free and unfettered trade, and diplomats wanting China to conform to the rules of international diplomacy. Each one of these 3 desires flew in the face of long-standing Chinese ideas of how barbarians should act towards China. China tried to control these Western desires only to fail in the end under the force of Western cannon and industrial might. The first missionaries, Jesuits, arrived in the late 15th, early 16th centuries. As China was more advanced than the West in many ways, the Jesuits had to fit conversion to Christianity into the Chinese reality, had to adapt Christianity to fit Chinese ideas. Adapt Christianity? What does that mean? There were various ways. One was to be very creative in translating Christian texts. For example, the Jesuits translated God as deity or Lord of Heaven, terms the Chinese were very familiar with, as they were commonly used to describe the emperor. Another change was in dress and habit. Jesuits dressed as Chinese, studied Chinese classics, and followed Chinese manners. While these changes helped, and early Jesuits did have some limited successes, their standing in China was due far more to practical earthly skills than metaphysical life-after-death arguments. Jesuits' success was about to be caught in a vice. Many Chinese officials had grown more and more suspicious and jealous of Jesuit influence, unhappy about the very idea that Chinese had to rely on barbarians. Then in 1706, a papal delegation to China was horrified to discover the Jesuits' creative translations and semantic arguments. They quickly issued an edict forbidding Catholic missionaries from letting the Chinese converts use this ruse. Hearing this, the Kangxi Emperor in turn gave missionaries a choice: sign a certificate agreeing with the creative translation or be expelled from China. While some Jesuits signed, most did not. Within a few decades, Christian influence and presence in China was minimal. Traders are the next in the troika of Westerners coming to change China. While Marco Polo returned to Venice from China in 1295, the Portuguese were really the first traders to come to China, arriving off the southern shores in the late 1500s. The Chinese demanded that all trading, and indeed all Western presence, be confined to Macau, near Hong Kong, and be done following strict Chinese rules. If the Portuguese wanted to trade, they had to do it the Chinese way, no exceptions, and only if they showed proper respect and acknowledged Chinese superiority. It worked at first, but didn't last. Chinese superiority was about to be put to the test by the British demand for the hot new drink from China, tea. The first British ships began to arrive in China in 1635, perhaps because the British did not demand formal relations with the Qing court, as the Portuguese and the Dutch who had arrived earlier had done. The British were soon allowed to operate out of Canton, now Guangzhou, not just Macau. China's trading system worked well at first. Though taxes were often excessive and arbitrary, the tea trade provided huge profits to both British and Chinese. Demand for tea continued to grow in England, but with it also grew a demand for expanded trade rights amongst the traders, as did their call for a fairer system. Another reason to want change was perhaps more important: inflation. The British wanted Chinese tea, but what did the Chinese want in return from Britain? Nothing. The British offered items like British manufacturers, cotton, woolen goods, but the Chinese were not impressed. Chinese wanted only one thing in return for their tea: silver. This outpouring of silver led to a drain on British reserves and creeping inflation. Enter the trade good everyone thinks of: opium. Contrary to what Chinese think, England did not invent opium smoking in China, but certainly did popularize it, making it cheap and widely available. Originally legal, China made opium illegal in 1813, but that did little to slow down the trade. As British demand for tea exploded, so did Western shipments of opium to China. British, French, and after 1794, American traders used China's long coastline and growing network of unofficial traders to offload their goods. Chinese officials were concerned for opium addicts, certainly, but another byproduct of opium smuggling bothered them even more: inflation. Chinese smugglers paid for opium with silver, leading to a huge and growing drain on China's silver reserves. The inflation shoe was now on the other foot. It hurt, and the Chinese vowed to stop the opium trade. No one was happy. Chinese officials wanted the traders to stop supplying opium, but the traders wanted free and open access to China's market. Tensions grew in the early decades of the 19th century, but before that it's time to introduce the third leg of the Western assault on China: the diplomats. While latest on the scene, the diplomats carried the most weight: control of naval cannon and army guns. During the first few hundred years of Western contact with China, the diplomats were absent. This began to change in the mid-1700s, especially concerning trade. Tea had put China on the diplomats' table. Trade was now more important to the nation, and British officials began to be concerned at how Chinese treated British traders. Initial attempts to discuss trade were met with Chinese silence. China was just not interested in talking to British officials, a point that came to bother the status-conscious British more and more. How dare they? Now we move to 1793. As I previously mentioned, the view from the Emperor's palace was glorious, China ascendant in every way, but a disturbance was coming: Lord Macartney from England. Lord Macartney had great difficulty even getting an audience from the Emperor. A barbarian meeting the Emperor was unheard of to the Chinese. Using the ruse of celebrating the Emperor's 80th birthday to gain the much-sought audience, Macartney then refused to kowtow. Prostrate yourself full length on the ground, forehead knocking on the floor. An unbelievable breach of decorum. The Lord instead bowed on one knee, European fashion. Macartney asked for a shopping list of demands. The Emperor refused all requests. Going further, he gave Macartney an official edict from himself to the British king. An amazing and revealing document. It begins: "You, O king, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial." Quite a beginning. It gets better. "As to your entreaty to send one of your nationals to be accredited to my celestial court, this request is contrary to the usage of my dynasty and cannot possibly be entertained. How can my dynasty alter its whole procedures and regulations in order to meet your individual views?" Not content just to dash British hopes of an embassy on lack of precedent, the Emperor thought of another logical reason for an embassy: to learn from the Chinese and to dash it as well. "If you assert that your reverence for our celestial dynasty fills you with the desire to acquire our civilization, our ceremonies and code of laws differ so completely from your own that, even if your envoy were able to acquire the rudiments of our civilization, you could not possibly transplant our manners and customs to your alien shore. Therefore, however adept your envoy might become, nothing would be gained thereby." Turning to Macartney's argument that China would surely benefit from all that England could offer, the Emperor wrote, "Our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and kings of all nations have offered their costly tribute by land and sea. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. The emperor ended with a warning. Should your vessels touch shore, your merchants will assuredly never be permitted to land or reside there, but will be subject to instant expulsion. In that event, your barbarian merchants will have a long journey for nothing. Don't say that you were not warned in time. Tremblingly obey and show no negligence. One does not need a time machine to imagine Lord Macartney's reaction to the Emperor's edict. How dare they? Nothing could be done about it, though. Macartney had no force with him to make the Chinese change. Chinese officials met future appeals for diplomatic representation, application of international laws and conventions, and proper opening of China to foreign trade with stubborn silence and rejection. Or with insults. For example, when Lord Napier tried in 1834 to communicate with the Canton governor and was told that the great ministers of the Celestial Empire are not permitted to have private intercourse by letter with outside barbarians. Outside barbarians? The Industrial Revolution was blossoming, a time when Westerners were sure of the superiority of Western civilization and the deficiencies of native cultures. There was no room for compromise. Neither the West nor China had any appreciation of or respect for the other side's point of view. A clash of cultures was inevitable. The missionaries wanted better access to Chinese poor and suffering. The traders wanted free access to China's markets and an end to being controlled by arbitrary laws and corrupt officials. The diplomats wanted diplomatic representation and for China to act within the confines of international standards. All China wanted was to be left alone. Only one side could win. Opium was the excuse that turned the smoldering clash of competing desires into the open flame of warfare. Opium imports into China increased dramatically over the years, from 600 chests in 1750 to 4,570 in 1800 to 23,750 in 1832. In 1838, the emperor called for the end of opium in China and sent Commissioner Lin to Canton to stamp it out. Lin tried to reason with the traders, explaining that if they knew how much suffering opium was causing, they would stop for humanitarian reasons. He even went so far as to write an impassioned, moralistic letter to Queen Victoria, telling her of the evils of the opium trade and asking her help to stamp it out. One wonders if she was amused, especially considering that opium was legal in England until 1878. The Western traders were not amused, though, and refused to give up their opium. Commissioner Lin blockaded the traders in their compound in Canton, and after 6 weeks the traders gave in. Commissioner Lin thought he had won. After washing 3 million pounds of opium into the ocean, he wrote a letter to the emperor, saying that the Westerners don't dare show any disrespect, and indeed I would judge from their attitudes that they have the decency to feel heartily ashamed. Not for the last time did a Chinese misunderstand Western attitudes and body language. The Westerners were not ashamed, they were angry. Once this news reached England, passions flared. The West was not going to stand for illegal Chinese acts against honest traders. The die was cast. If China would not accede to reasonable Western requests, if China refused to act civilized, well, the West would force them to. Within 20 years, 1840 to 1860, the West and China fought 2 wars, Opium Wars 1 and 2. China lost both, badly. Besides having to pay huge fines, China began to lose control of its own territory, or, in the case of Hong Kong, to lose the territory itself. Among the new conditions, Westerners would be tried by Western, not Chinese laws, traders could trade anywhere with anyone, missionaries were free to roam throughout China, and diplomats were able to open embassies in Beijing. While China never became a colony like India or Vietnam, it was close. In the years after 1860, there was a veritable land rush as Western powers flooded into China to claim their separate concessions or spheres of influence, geographic territories where their nationals had special privileges. Besides the original two big players, Britain and France, came many non-traditional powers: Italy, Austria, Germany, Russia, and, for the first time, an Asian nation, Japan. The Chinese buffet was open, and each foreign power took its turn filling its plate to the brim. What did China do to stop this? The short answer is not enough. Unlike Japan, China did not accept that the world had changed and it had to change with it. The Chinese court and vast majority of officials and gentry turned backwards, seeking answers from past glories to the problems now facing China. There was a revival of Confucian teaching, with stress on China's moral superiority and its application to practical affairs. Edicts from Beijing reinforced notions like the health and preservation of Chinese society depended upon the strict hierarchical organization, with all following the proper rules and procedures for their position. While egalitarianism was sweeping the world, China stressed elitism. The ideal was static harmony, not dynamic growth. Not all Chinese accepted this conservative vision of how China should react to Western encroachment on Chinese sovereignty. A small group of important scholars, gentry, generals began to argue China was weak not because of moral bankruptcy or because it lacked men of ability, but because it refused to change its institutions, especially the education system. These agitators believed Chinese officials must learn more from the West, a radical departure from thousands of years of Chinese practice. Learn in practical areas like mathematics, military science, technology, science, and geography. Yet even these forward-looking Chinese strongly believed in the basic superiority of Chinese culture. A popular slogan of the time sums up their attitude: Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for practice. The agitators believed China did not need to make any basic changes, just learn Western techniques, then graft them onto the Chinese system. Such a belief severely hampered their efforts, leading to cases like chemistry explained as stemming from the Chinese ancient belief in the five elements. Everything new had to fit into old Chinese beliefs and could not upset Chinese values. For example, China sent 120 students to the U.S. for study, but when Chinese officials saw they were adapting successfully to Western life and education, the officials said the students were becoming too westernized and had them sent back to China. The emphasis was always on changing the absolute minimum amount. Nevertheless, from this group sprang China's first capitalists, investing in railways, shipping, textiles, and mining. These efforts withered, though, in large part because of a lack of support from Beijing and the ruling class. The conservative majority thought such modern or Western things like railroads or steamboats would hurt the people's livelihood, a good, albeit short-term, economic argument. In one classic example, China's first railroad was bought by a conservative official, who then tore it up. China's situation continued to unravel throughout the latter half of the 19th century. One disaster followed another. During the Sino-French War of 1883-85, the French destroyed large parts of China's modern navy, and China lost control of Vietnam. To ensure this humiliation would not be repeated, China undertook a huge 10-year naval buildup, but to no avail. In 1895, China and Japan fought over control of Korea. China's navy was decisively defeated, and China lost control of Korea and Formosa, Taiwan. One disaster followed another. During the Sino-French War of 1883-85, the French destroyed large parts of China's modern navy, and China lost control of Vietnam. To ensure this humiliation would not be repeated, China undertook a huge 10-year naval buildup, but to no avail. In 1895, China and Japan fought over control of Korea. China's navy was decisively defeated, and China lost control of Korea and Formosa, Taiwan. Why didn't the Chinese naval investment pay off? It was the same old problems. Chinese spent money on hardware and not software, on ships and guns but not on training sailors. Massive corruption led to naval shells with no gunpowder, and funds meant for Navy ships were diverted to rebuilding the Summer Palace. My story ends here. I leave out the Boxer Rebellion, the end of the Qing dynasty, the rise of the warlords, Sun Yat-sen and the Republic of China, the Long March, Japanese aggression and World War II, civil war between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, China divided. To explain such an eventful and calamitous century would take at least another hour, and while fascinating, would not add much to the themes already described. Here are some of the major themes and lessons from this brief look at Chinese history. 1. China is truly unlike any other major civilization. It developed on its own, and because of that developed a belief that China was the true, the only center of civilization. Such a belief was quite natural. Until the coming of the West, every culture China encountered wanted to learn from the Chinese. 2. China is the only ancient civilization that still exists today. Amazingly stable, the Confucian system remained unchanged for over 2,000 years and still strongly echoes throughout Chinese culture today. 3. Chinese see themselves as the inheritors of the glory of imperial China, and see what happened in the past less as dry history in books than as colorful stories of their extended family. 4. China produced the most successful culture the world has ever seen. If the West had not arrived, China would not have changed. This is what the Chinese learn in schools today. 5. China had no experience learning from the outside. The few lessons they did import were changed to fit Chinese prior beliefs before they were accepted or used. Westerners arrived to change China, not learn from it. Other than the Jesuits, Westerners neither respected Chinese ways nor tried to fit Western ideas into the Chinese cultural environment. 7. China only changed when forced to, then changes were the absolute minimum to solve the current crisis. The Chinese never developed a proactive policy towards change. I ask you to remember the above points when thinking about and dealing with the Chinese. Westerners still want the Chinese to change. WTO, copyright protection, contract law, and too often still don't pay attention to China's unique situation. The biggest lesson Westerners should learn is instead of insisting Chinese do things your way, look at how you can adapt your ways to meet Chinese sensibilities. Westerners are results-oriented people, not process-oriented. Success in Chinese Asia comes from focusing on the result, not the process, a mistake Westerners make all too often. The final lesson I hope you take from this brief examination of Chinese history is respect for what China was and sympathy for the position Chinese Asia is in now. Change was forced upon the Chinese, changes they were unprepared for. Changes are still being forced on the Chinese, and while one could argue that they could and should have done better in the last 100 years to prepare citizens for such changes, the truth is they have not. Thank you. Greg Biskey.